Welcome to Hard Talk with me, Zeinab Badawi. My guest today is the award-winning Palestinian author and lawyer Raja Shehadeh. For 3 decades, he has written many books about human rights and the Israeli occupation. His family were forced to leave Jaffa in 1948 and settled in Ramallah on the West Bank, where he lives today. He says he hopes his work has helped further the cause of peace. Has it? Raja Shehadeh, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you, it's a pleasure.
You've been writing about the Palestinian situation for more than 3 decades now. Have you got anything new to say?
Always, because it's always a changing situation. And my styles change with time, and I become better practiced as a writer. I started doing a lot on the legal aspects and wrote tremendously on the land issue. And then I found that writing in a literary style, as I did in Palestinian Walks, made all the difference, because so many people after Palestinian Walks said, now we finally understand what it is like and about the land question. And I had written so much before on the legal aspects, and nobody ever said that.
You wrote Palestinian Walks in 2007, and in fact, in the book, you describe your final walk in the book in Ramallah, and you talked about how you meet a young, armed Israeli settler who also grew up in the area and says he loves the same hills as you do. That really encapsulates how the love of the land is not only one that the Palestinians feel.
Absolutely, and not only Palestinians and Israelis, anybody who comes to our land loves it, because it's a beautiful land and very attractive and very conducive to walks and pleasures and picnics. So the issue is not depriving anybody from the love of the land and from being in the land. The only question is in what capacity to live on the land.
That's the point, though, that young Israeli armed settler felt that it was his land as much as you feel that it's your land.
Well, it's more than a feeling, because he is there in the capacity of a colonizer to all extents and purposes. Because
he doesn't see it that way, though.
No. But the facts are that he shares unequally with the land. The possibility for him to expand his settlements is tremendous, whereas our capacity for and permission to expand Ramallah, where I live, is very, very limited because of the discriminatory zoning laws that were imposed by Israel before the Oslo Accords, before 1993. And our access to natural resources is limited.
But yet, just looking at the story that you had, I mean, it didn't stop you conversing with the young man. You even shared a water pipe with him.
Yeah.
Doesn't that then perhaps suggest that there is potential for dialogue and understanding? Will you share something like that with him?
I think there is a lot of potential, because Jews and Muslims and Christians in Palestine forever, for many, many, many centuries, lived together. And there's nothing in the DNA or in any fundamental way that doesn't allow these 2 groups or 3 groups to live together. It's only because there is occupation, there is discrimination, there is apartheid.
You've written about occupation, and in your latest book, Language of War, Language of Peace, you say this: I came to terms long ago with the fact that books have limited power to affect history and politics. Yet my optimism keeps me hopeful that by helping readers to better understand what is taking place here, and by proposing things they can do to make change possible, the cause of peace will be furthered. Do you honestly believe that your writing, your books, can further the cause of peace, change people's minds?
I don't want to flatter myself, but I think every little bit counts. And reading a book is not like looking at the news reel on television, because when you read a book, you engage with the writing, and you are moved emotionally. And if the book is successful and the writing is good, then this emotional association gets into your being, and then you never forget. I'm reminded
but that
of
just
things.
only, okay, you write in a very emotive way about factual things, as you said, and obviously you're a highly celebrated writer, very influential, read in many, many countries. So you may stir emotions in people, but does that actually translate into action? And what kind of action do you want them to take?
Oh, very good. Because if we look at the situation objectively, we know that governments are not going to help us in the cause of justice. It's going to be people and people's power that is going to make all the difference. And that was the case in South Africa with the apartheid. The governments were the last to come along. And I think this is the case in Palestine, Israel.
Okay, you say people's power can make the difference. What people? Because you write in English. So obviously that means Palestinians aren't necessarily going to read your work.
Well,
and other Arabs. So do you see the agents of change, those readers that you wish to influence, people in the wider international community?
First of all, Palestinians are educated people, and many can read English.
Of course.
My books are sold very widely in Palestine, in the occupied territories. So it does have an effect at home. But you know, our case is an international thing. It's the most celebrated and most important issue in the world today. One of the most important, certainly. And as there is responsibility for the people in this country for what happened to us in Palestine, there is also the possibility for them to do something to help.
So who are these them? Who are these readers you're trying to reach, essentially?
Populations of Western countries,
right.
Because they have a lot of influence on Israel, and Israel is not going to change unless it feels it needs to change, unless it begins to feel that people are not happy, are not accepting of their practices. And so far this hasn't happened.
So you feel that the greater emphasis should be put on the agents of change outside the Palestinian
agents
communities?
of change outside and inside. Inside, it's very important for me to preserve things that will vanish if they're not written about. So for example, many of the scenes and places in the landscape that I write about have vanished, actually. And so I try to preserve in words what has been lost in fact. And I write about the experiences of the First Intifada, for example, which now has become ancient history for the two generations that have come after it. And it's very important to remind people of how it was and what was experienced.
So one way that you have tried to influence change inside the occupied territories and also Israel as a whole is through your work as a lawyer. You followed in the footsteps of your late father, also a very prominent Palestinian, Raja Shehadeh, who was highly unusual amongst Palestinians. He actually practiced in Israeli military and civilian courts, and the Palestinian Lawyers Union, of course, condemned this action and said he shouldn't have done that. You also have done the same by taking up cases in Israeli military courts. You felt that a legal approach to try to get justice for the Palestinians using Israeli law may actually help further the cause. But here you are, so many years later, it hasn't, has it? It
hasn't at all. And if I had stopped at that and just been a lawyer trying again and again at gaining justice through the courts and Israeli courts, I would have despaired long ago. It's good that I had another venue to express myself, which is the writing. But you know...
Why did it fail, though? Because, I mean, you were harassed, you would have your offices ransacked, you'd have court dates would be moved and so on. So you were harassed by the Israeli authorities on the one hand and then condemned by the Palestinians on the other. It was a lose-lose situation for you.
Well, the condemnation by the Palestinians stopped as time went by, because the idea of a strike for the lawyers was popular in the first years of the occupation and then stopped being popular, and many more lawyers began to practice. It failed because the Israeli system and the Israeli High Court in particular failed to act in the proper way of an Israeli High Court. Although the propaganda was, and constantly being repeated, that Israel is so democratic that it allows its courts to be a resort to the people of the occupation, of the occupied people. But unfortunately, they didn't help the cause of justice. And I think when the history is written in the future, there would be condemnation for the Israeli high court.
That's what you describe in your book about how one Israeli lawyer talked about occupied territories and the judge admonished her and said, you can't say
yes, exactly.
Occupied territories, and that's what you mean by language of law, language of peace. But your late father, Aziz Shehadeh, it was actually quite a sad, painful chapter in your life because you had fallen out a little bit with him, or quite considerably, and he was murdered in 1984 by what you found out 15 years later was allegedly a Palestinian collaborator who then subsequently died in a drugs-related killing himself. But here's the irony of somebody like you and your father who tried to pursue justice, and yet in the end justice was never served on your father's killers. That must be rather sad.
It is sad, but there are no guarantees. You don't pursue justice and try because you are assured of success. You try and try because you must try, because you cannot but try. The only thing that I learned is that after my father tried for many years, the first years of the occupation, and then he saw how things are deteriorating and more settlements are being built and the right wing is gaining ground in Israel, he became depressed. And every time I get into a state of depression, I remember how bad it was for my father to be depressed, and I try to not repeat his mistake in getting depressed, because there is a lot to be depressed about, but it's also important to keep on going.
Your family came from Jaffa and lived very comfortably. As I said, you were from a prominent Christian family. I know you're not a practicing Christian, but the way you talk, one feels that perhaps, and sometimes perhaps it comes through in your writings, that there's a sense of bitterness there as well.
I suppose you're right. I mean, I'll have to take your opinion on this. I hope I can overcome the bitterness, and I try to overcome the bitterness, because I don't think it makes for good writing if you're bitter. So it's a struggle. It's a struggle. But at the same time, I don't think good writing can come from being not in touch with one's emotions. And the way I do it, the way I write, is I constantly write diary. I've been writing my diary since the beginning of the occupation 44 years ago. And in the diary, I express my emotions immediately, without restraint, without censorship, without any thought. And then I finish with getting everything out. And when I write using the diary, if the subject requires that I use the diary, I go over it and then distill it and work on it so that it becomes more communicable and less bitter.
But less bitter. But you're obviously, the fact that you are a lawyer and you have this strong sense of justice, you say, and so on, that sense of injustice, almost anger, is there?
Of course, there's a lot of anger. I mean, when you know, this book had, I was hoping would end with the end of the negotiations, and the end of the negotiations would be a good end, because as I was writing, Kerry, the Secretary of State of the US, was coming and going, and I thought a superpower like America would not spend so much time if they didn't believe they could get somewhere. And so I bet with my wife for $1 million that he would succeed, and I lost $1 million. But of course, it ended up that the negotiations were a failure, so I couldn't end on a high point. The book could not be called Language of Peace, it had to be called Language of War.
You bring up John Kerry's efforts to try to bring about negotiations and a solution between the Arabs and Israelis. And Dennis Ross, who from 1993 to 2001 was the US chief negotiator, said this year that there had been 3 serious offers made to the Palestinians. Clinton parameters in 2000, Ehud Olmert as Prime Minister, offer in 2008, and John Kerry's efforts in 2014. And he says, in each case, a proposal on all the core issues, right of return for refugees, the future of East Jerusalem, and where the borders of a Palestinian state would be. He says these issues, core issues, were made to Palestinian leaders, and the answer was either no or no response. So to what extent do you feel that Palestinians themselves share the burden of blame in not getting a resolution after so many decades?
There's no question that when there are two sides, there is a blame on both sides, but it's an unequal blame. And I think the role of the Palestinians in this case is insignificant in terms of...
But you accept there is blame on both sides, you've just said, even if it's unequal.
There has to be some blame, because obviously there are two sides. And then
what kind of blame do you attribute then to the Palestinians?
Well, they could have done something earlier, before things got so...
It's interesting you say they, not we.
Well, the leadership.
Oh, you mean the
I'm
leadership?
not leadership.
Okay.
So they could have rushed it a bit, but they didn't, and maybe they couldn't. But you know, in response to Ross, I quote Farage, who is the head of the intelligence, and he said something very important. He told the Americans and the Israelis, "You don't see us." Throughout the negotiations with the Americans that ended in April of last year, they never presented to the Palestinian side the offers. They always presented them and negotiated with the Israelis and took for granted the Palestinians.
But the fact is, I mean, okay, you make that point, but Dennis Ross explains a little bit more why he feels that the Palestinians have said no, not only to Kerry last year, but also in the past, and we can't go into the detail of all of those. And he says it's because Palestinian political culture is rooted in a narrative of injustice. Its anti-colonialist bent and its deep sense of grievance treats concessions to Israel as illegitimate.
I totally do not accept this. I totally do not accept it. The facts are that the Palestinians at this point are absolutely willing to make concessions. It is Israel which has been refusing consistently to make concessions. And the refusal not start today. There is now open archives from 1967, and somebody called Aviraz wrote a book called The Bride and the Dowry about the first 2 years of occupation, in which he describes the Israeli reaction to my father's proposal. And the reaction...
Your father proposed the two-state solution,
two-state solution
long before anybody did.
Yeah.
But I have to say, he was accused, wasn't he, by Palestinians of being a traitor, of being a collaborator, when he suggested the two-state solution.
But then he had support in the West Bank, and the Israelis could have taken this proposal and saved us from all these years of misery and saved themselves. But they refused to make... Moshe Dayan, after the occupation, said...
That was the Minister of Defense years ago,
Minister
67,
of Defense,
yes, the Israelis, yeah.
Said Israel is now an empire. And I think they believe that and continue to believe that. They are an empire.
But
why should they make concessions?
The fact is, though, you know, the Palestinian leadership has, and I know you're not part of the leadership, but they have called off talks because of the building of settlements and so on. And, you know, they've said, well, these are our red lines and so on. So maybe the Palestinians and the Israelis should agree on the 1967 borders as the Arab King Abdullah plan says, and then work out the details where the borders should be drawn later on and so on.
But that's what they're trying to do in the UN, and Israel is adamant against it, and the US is adamant against it. Israel is absolutely sure that they do not want to withdraw. They call it redeployment anyway. They do not want to withdraw to the 67.
Okay, and this fact that you feel is true, that they don't want to withdraw, is one that has been echoed by many other Palestinians, including, I'll just give you one example, Musa al-Gharbi, who is an academic from the study of Middle East conflicts. He says, there never was a two-state solution and there won't be one in the foreseeable future. Instead, this so-called solution only serves to enable Israel's continued oppression. The only visible resolution is to unite Israel and the territories into a single state.
If that were possible, that would be lovely, but that's not possible, because in order for that to happen, you have to have the approval of Israel, and Israel is not going to approve that.
So you still stick to the two-state solution?
I am in the unpopular camp of people who stick to the two-state solution, and my reason is that what settlement is about is not just settlement. The issue is dismantling settlements, and dismantling settlements is dismantling the principles, the ideologies, the underpinnings of settlement, which go back to 1948.
But the fact is, though, you're not going to see a dismantling of the settlements, are you now? I mean, when you get people who are relatively to the centre of the Israeli political spectrum, like the President Shimon Peres, who stepped down last year, he says, why should we withdraw from the territories? Because look what happened when we left Gaza in 2005. And he said last year it's becoming increasingly difficult to argue that Israel should withdraw from its settlements in the West Bank because they say, look what's happened in Gaza, we've got the rockets being fired at us, and he says they could have made it into a tourist haven and so on, and look what's happened. Okay, that's what they say.
He's never been a man of peace, this Peretz. He pretends to be a man of peace and he says the most terrible
But he's
thing.
not the only one who's made that point.
Yeah, but this point is full of lies and errors and mistakes, because Israel never left Gaza. Israel is continuing in Gaza, is making Gaza into a large prison, and not enabling Gaza to develop. So their idea that Gaza could become a haven for tourism is nonsense, absolute nonsense, and they know it. And the idea that there was this engagement, meaning withdrawal of the occupation, is absolutely not true.
But don't you see that now what is going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis is part of a wider narrative in the Middle East? So when people see the actions of a minority of extremists in the Middle East, ISIL in Syria and Iraq, and what they're doing, then it plays into the narrative of what's going on, and you get the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu saying, we will not countenance a fully sovereign Palestinian state in the West Bank because of the fear of extremism. There cannot be a situation, he says, under any agreement in which we relinquish security control of the territory west of the River Jordan.
If only this were true. Netanyahu never accepted, under any condition, to withdraw from the West Bank, and he is on record to saying that. I'll tell you something. Could it have been possible to end apartheid without ending the system of apartheid? And the system of apartheid is well and alive in Palestine.
Well, you know, the Israelis say that you cannot make that same comparison because the apartheid system was based on race, and of course citizens of Israel are not based on race. You have black Israelis who originally were from Ethiopia and the former Arab countries and so on. But I just make that proviso.
No, I want to say something. I have a whole chapter here in this book about the continuation of the same methods that Israel used against the Palestinians who stayed in Palestine, which became Israel, and those that were used in the West Bank. The only problem is the Palestinians failed to learn and prevent this by taking precautionary...
But just to develop the point I made to you about the fact that you can't ignore what's going on in the region, it was summed up quite well by an article in Time magazine in January this year, that the threat of ISIL and such other groups means that the Palestinian standoff with Israel is a geopolitical luxury. That is the case, isn't it?
No, it's not the case, because I think the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is at the core of the problems of the Middle East. And I have absolute certainty that if you resolve that conflict, so many things will be resolved. If you don't resolve that conflict, nothing is going to be resolved. So all these attempts at widening the scope and saying, oh, we have to worry about this is exactly what Israel likes to happen.
In the opening chapter of your book, you say that you're convinced that however long it takes, the optimism of the will is ultimately bound to triumph. Finally, when do you think that might be in your lifetime?
I don't know if it's going to be in my lifetime, and I don't think we can have the luxury of saying that it must happen in my lifetime, but we have always the hope that it will happen in our lifetime, and it's the only thing that gives us ability to continue, that we want it to happen in our lifetime, and we do everything we can in order to make that real. I hope.
You say that you're part of a generation that failed. Do you think that the younger generation of Palestinians should do something differently? Will they succeed?
What I know is that the young are not necessarily bound by the older generation, and I realized this after the Oslo Accords were signed. And the Oslo Accords were, to me, from the beginning, a dead end, because they pretended to be for peace, and they were nothing likely to bring peace. But the day after there was an agreement between the PLO and Israel, the young people who had been saying, we will fight Israel to the end, with violence, with everything it takes, the next day, they were saying, you know, we have to have a chance. It's our life. Why not try to make peace with Israel? And they completely changed. And they started making relations with Israelis and joint projects. And then I realized, you know, my memories of the past are not shared. And how can they be?
Raja Shehadeh, thank you very much indeed for coming on Hard Talk.
Pleasure.
Thank you.